let's talk a little bit about the history and the present of seeing into the future. Science fiction is one of my favorite forms of literature. It's one of my favorite forms of art. And science fiction, you can people debate about what the origins of it were. People talk about H.G. Wells as being an early sort of popularizer of ideas of science fiction, and there certainly was um, early proto ideas around that time, very early 20th century. And the dawn of sort of true what we think of as science fiction, where spaceships and ray guns and whatnot, um, was not really taken seriously. The sort of pre-golden era, the pulp science fiction era, was a bunch of space westerns, um, and that all sort of changed with the big thinkers of the golden era of science fiction, the that put forth really radical ideas about what a future could look like. And this coincided, in the 30s and 40s with some of the most tumultuous decades uh, in in recorded human history. I mean, the atomic uh, revolution, where we created the atomic bomb and started making atomic energy, kicked off the so-called atomic era of the late 40s and 50s, where everything had this sort of Jetsons craze, and that fueled this notion that drove the imaginations of all these sci-fi authors and consumers that the world was going to be fantastically different because we would have unlimited sources of energy and this future with flying cars and so on. And that golden era, um, people's careers lasted longer than these eras. That golden era lasted quite a while and developed and became more rich in the stories that it was telling and told more human stories and more compelling stories, and was no longer just telling hard science fiction what ifs, but was telling real interesting stories. So the sort of Arthur Clarkes of the world, the Isaac Asimovs, the Ray Bradburys, and Larry Nivens, who have these hypothetical situations, the Philip K. Dicks, where the world they imagine is different than our world in some technological way or some advancement that changes society, and then they fill out what that society looks like, has just been a wonderful series of thought experiments and a dialogue between the authors and each other and the authors and the readers for over a century, where people say, what if there were flying cars? What would society look like? And then they imagine a whole society like that. And then the next author goes, oh, flying cars? Well, I don't think it would be the way you thought of it. It would be more like this. And the atomic era sort of gave way to the sort of space race and the Cold War. And the space race, you know, working to put men on the moon and rockets in space, the price of rocketry was just plummeting because of all of our investment and advancement in that. And our uh, environment was first seen as being a problem. Silent Spring came out, and the environmental movement started in the early 70s, and we started to see challenges where people started talking about global overpopulation and challenges with recycling and ozone and climate change. And we started to look to the skies and be like, well, rockets will save us. The future will be leaving Earth and going and colonizing Mars and colonizing other star systems, and we will grow past this planet. And there was this huge optimism because there was so much advancement and so much development, and the pace of development was so fast. By the time the Concorde flew, and by the time we had landed spaceships on the moon and walked on another celestial body, was less than a century after the first powered flight. And so we just thought, the sky is not even the limit. The sky is our next step in this journey. And there was this huge optimism until um, that optimism just got hit in the side of the head by a wave that no one saw coming. I guess some people saw it coming. They were um, quite advanced thinkers, I think, socially and culturally for their time. Uh, Pieces like Neuromancer in the early 80s, pieces like Blade Runner, and the origins of what we now call cyberpunk was the birth of these ideas of, oh, it's not going to come true. This promise of leaving the planet and living an idealized um, spaceship fantasy in some rotating wheel that's orbiting the planet, and we're going to mine asteroids and we're going to live in space, and everyone is going to have, you know, this perfect life because we'll be beyond resource limitation, and technology will save us um, all sort of came crashing down once we started writing books like that, and readers and authors and the culture all sort of woke up simultaneously to this idea of like, it it's not going to come true, that those promises don't really seem like the solutions to the challenges we're going to face. And there was a real sort of bleakness uh, in the stories that we were telling from that point in the early 80s forward. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, the 90s had a very marked shift in the zeitgeist of at least Western cultures. There was no longer an arms race, there was no longer a Cold War. So there was a lot of introspection and a lot of, what are we doing? What does the global hegemony look like now that there's a single actor that is driving the ship, so to speak? And I think that introspection um, eroded away the negativity from that cyberpunk era. The cyberpunk sort of continued on, and there were some real seminal works in that. And science fiction certainly carried on, but it was no longer a vanguard of asking cultural questions. There was another piece in the history of science fiction that was this sort of unexpected, out of nowhere, absolutely couldn't predict it, and we didn't know we wanted it, but everyone who came across it realized afterwards that they did need it in their life, and that's Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy. And bringing that sort of levity and humor into science fiction after, I know Hitchhikers predates the 90s by quite a bit, but after the fall of the Soviet Union and the 90s, people, that was sort of always perennially in people's, you know, it's sort of like Monty Python. It had just been there throughout everything. But the young people who were growing up in the 90s had been exposed to the hard science fiction Isaac Asimovs of the past, and had been exposed to Douglas Adams. And so the writers who were young in the 80s and 90s, who understand that cynicism, who didn't grow up prior to the cynicism, who didn't grow up in the 60s, right? Who might have seen the tail end of the rocket era, but really understood that cyberpunk cynicism and that sort of hollowness afterwards when the Cold War ended, are writers who sort of made this science fiction 2.0 landscape. The Andy Weirs and the John Scalzis and the Dennis Taylors and the Scott Myers and the Martha Wells and all of these fantastic modern writers who are taking, fortunately, some of the levity and humor of Douglas Adams and some of the fantastic ideas of, and that conversational structure of some of the earlier hard science fiction writers, and putting them together in a modern synthesis that is really qualitatively beyond its predecessors. there were definitely works earlier that were absolutely fantastic. But as a whole, I think the genre is much better now than it is much higher quality now than it has been in the past. And a book or a trilogy came out in the past couple of years, which I think might signal that we're moving into another sort of level. We're moving past this sci-fi 2.0, and science fiction might regain some of the um, cultural eminence of the earlier era when we were asking questions about what does the future look like. And that trilogy is The Three Body Problem by, I apologize for the pronunciation, Liu Shixing. Um, and that story, those three books, that story is so fantastic. It has 30 novels worth of science fiction ideas in there, and the human story it tells is fantastic. And it comes from a perspective that is apart from the worldview that I was comfortable with growing up of a sort of Western hegemony. And it fundamentally casts humanity as facing existential crisis in a way that I have never seen before, and in a way that is so powerful and I think has been so rare to explore so well, that if more people um, follow his lead, I think we might be at the dawn or be at a sort of inflection point in the science fiction genre. I think it would not be controversial to say that we live in a period of uncertainty for our future. We don't really know what the next few decades will look like. There are certainly uh, political challenges, socioeconomic challenges, environmental challenges, technical challenges. Um, there is new technologies that previous science fiction authors had never considered that we don't know how they'll be implemented. I, you know, every technology we've ever invented has been turned into a weapon, except genetic engineering, yet. Uh, and maybe that has been turned into a weapon and I just don't know the details of it. But we invented chemistry in the 19th century, and 100 years later we were selling chemistry kits for 11-year-olds Christmas gifts, and they were opening up, do it at your own chemistry kits. We split the atom, and now we have hundreds of nuclear powered ships roaming around the oceans. There are teenagers who have made nuclear fusers that created helium out of tritium water and microwave inverters in their garage. The level of adoption of every technology when it becomes consumer grade and widely usable by a huge number of people absolutely changes global landscapes and social dynamics and our culture. And we have some technologies that are coming up that absolutely will do that. And we have some cultural and social changes that the way we implement these technologies that we are currently developing and have at our fingertips, we'll have to better understand what that will look like as we move forward. I think science fiction is going to be a really important tool for our culture and our society to understand that, to ask the questions that need to be asked, to think through those problems, and to ultimately come to an understanding. And I look forward to some of the talented young authors and old authors who are going to write those stories. So if you have thoughts on this, please share them. I love to hear them. The more we push conversations like this forward, the more we all can enjoy these fictions together. Thank you very much.